Cult Cinema Podcast.
Mr. Brown, that's a little too close to Mr. Shit.
You shoot me in a dream, you better wake up and apologize.
All right, welcome back, cultists, to a new episode of the Cult Cinema Podcast. I am Gage.
I'm Ashley.
And today we are on to episode 24. We're talking about Reservoir Dogs.
You said you'd seen this or no?
I have not. Well, I started watching it. I've watched like the first maybe 10 minutes of it like a long time ago, but this is my first time watching it like all the way through.
Okay.
I definitely liked it a lot. I was talking to my buddy Sam about it. It's a pretty good movie where considering not a lot happens.
Right. This might be a short episode because there is not a lot to talk about.
Well, I do have like 2 pages worth of notes here because the whole like creation of this movie is kind of bonkers in terms of like how much of a struggle it was. So this is directed by Quinton Tarantino, released in 1992.
Right. First Tarantino film on the pod.
Right. Yeah. His directorial debut. So before we get into the scene by scene, I kind of want to break down a little bit of like how this film kind of came to be.
Okay.
So originally, Quentin worked on this film. He wrote this film because he was kind of in a position where he had written 2 screenplays already, which were Natural Born Killers and True Romance. He ended up selling those stories. And they ended up being directed by 2 different people. Oliver Stone ended up directing Natural Born Killers, and Tony Scott would go on to direct True Romance. But while these movies were still in production, because these movies ended up releasing after Reservoir Dogs came out.
Right.
It was after he sold the script, or around the time that he sold the scripts, that Tarantino kind of wrote the story for this in about 3 weeks, it says.
Yeah, not long.
Yeah. And having written 2 movies that would go on to be directed by 2 other people, Tarantino was determined that he was going to direct this one, even if it meant working off of a shoestring budget and shooting in black and white and 16 millimeter. Because originally that was the plan, and they were working off of a budget from somewhere between $16,000 to $30,000. It varies depending on where you look.
Wow.
But yeah, it ended up being filmed in about 5 weeks, and They did have a lot of trouble getting financing because Tarantino worked with a producer friend, Lawrence Bender, who assisted with getting funding. They were originally approached by a couple different production companies, but a lot of them were very restrictive. One in particular was a Canadian film company and film producer who offered Tarantino and Bender $1.6 million to finance the film as long as this Canadian producer's girlfriend got to play Mr. Blonde and as long as they changed the ending so that everybody lives. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen this near 30-year-old
If you haven't seen it by now, yeah.
Everybody dies.
Fuck right off then,
yeah.
I guess.
But yeah, so they were like, fuck that, we want to keep the creative integrity of the film.
That would have been weird to put a random female in here.
But besides that, there is only one, there's no like speaking female parts in the entire movie. The only thing that came from it was a deleted scene where a character named McCluskey, played by Nina Simasko, I probably butchered that hard, but she basically gives a rundown to Mr. Orange because he's an undercover cop. He's basically the one giving she's the one giving the rundown on everybody in this gang that he's going to be working with. But that part was completely cut from the film.
Okay.
But yeah, so they've struggled to get financing. Eventually, Harvey Keitel ended up getting a copy of the script from a friend of Bender's. And he was, all about trying to, at the time, trying to help independent filmmakers kind of make their way into the industry. And so he helped a lot with not just starring in the film, but also producing and helping a lot with casting. It was their connection to Keitel that would eventually get them. What was the name of the guy that ended up helping? It was the vice president of live entertainment at the time. Yeah, so
distribution or
so Keitel kind of helped them come in contact with this other production company that would go on to completely finance the film, giving them around $1.5 to $1.6 million.
Okay.
But yeah, it was kind of a whole nightmare to get the whole thing funded. But eventually they did it, and they managed to shoot and produce the film before, Tony Scott and Oliver Stone would manage to create the other two movies that Quentin had written at the time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of wild. Like I said, about 5 weeks to shoot the entire thing. 1.5 million is still a very small budget, but it is well executed. There are a couple, things here and there that they had to, a couple restrictions that they came across. Like a lot of the actors had to bring their own wardrobe. The Cadillac that Michael Madsen's character Vic Vega uses is actually Michael Madsen's Cadillac.
His car.
But yeah, so of course they had their budgetary constraints, but with that, I don't think that really affected the quality of the movie at all.
Clearly not.
But yeah, I don't know how much of my whole explanation there was very coherent, but
oh no, it was fine. Yeah, I've seen this film I don't know how many times. I don't love it. It's not my favorite Tarantino film by any means.
I wouldn't say it's mine either.
No, but for what it does, it's good. The story is, I guess, okay. The back and forth between how everybody roundabout knows each other is okay, but yeah, I don't know. Not a lot happens, so it is what it is.
It's a lot of just. Oh, sorry, Richard Gladstein. Gladstein is the name of the producer who, or the vice president of live entertainment. God, I can't speak today. Was the one that they eventually got in contact with and helped finance the film.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, so there's not a lot that kind of happens in this movie, and we'll kind of talk about it. You'll hear it in the scene by scene, where they do have, a couple scenes here and there that are a little bit more action-packed and gruesome than the others, but it's, just either guys in a warehouse talking, or guys in a car talking, or guys in a diner talking, and the dialogue is still very interesting to the point where I didn't really get bored of it or anything like that, because sometimes I do when it's a film like this where nothing, like I said, nothing really happens, because it's all takes place like after the big heist and everything. So we don't see any of the action of that, but
I do love Tarantino's writing style, how he writes characters. I think that's always really well done in all of his films, whether they're cheesy or not. I mean, he's a really good writer.
Or a little bit more racist than you would, than you feel comfortable with.
Well, I think this is 2022. I think we all know Quentin Tarantino's just a little racist.
Just a little, baby. Just a little bit.
That's really not a surprise.
Yeah.
He just got away with it in the, 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I'm glad you did some, deep diving.
Yeah, I went, on a 2-hour research spree, because just going through, some video essays and some of the IMDb trivia. Of course, we'll link our sources in the description if people want to check those out.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's pretty much all I wanted to start off with. I suppose we can go ahead and jump into the scene by scene and go from there.
Okay. Cool beans. Well, yeah, like you said, 1992, Reservoir Dogs, first Tarantino film. Exciting on the pod. I will go ahead and list the cast now, and then I'll list them again. I think I do in their... yep, okay. I do with their names in the movie.
Okay.
So, obviously an all-star cast now. Steve Buscemi, Michael Madsen, Tim Roth, Harvey Keitel, and Quentin Tarantino himself, just among some of the major actors in this film. So we open with just a bunch of dudes sitting in a diner. And again, there's not a lot going on in this scene except for some guy talk back and forth. We see Big Joe, the bald dude, rambling about this book he found. And it's kind of a all-around table discussion of random stories from every one of these guys. The really only important thing about this conversation is Harvey Keitel and Joe kind of go back and forth about this book and also, they get into this tip discussion because Steve Buscemi will not tip the waitress. And that's a good 5-minute conversation about how he's an asshole and won't tip waitresses.
Apparently, it was in the script, it was going to be Mr. White, who Harvey Keitel plays. It was supposed to be his whole tangent. And then eventually
I bet Harvey Keitel was like, no.
Yeah.
His mother was a waitress.
Keitel's mother?
Yep, Google it. That's part of
you.
why he goes on this rant in this movie about how single mothers, this is the number one industry they work in. Because his mother was a waitress. But yeah, Steve Buscemi won't tip the waitress because he's a fucking douchebag. And roundabout way, everybody starts bitching at him and he eventually relents and tips the waitress. So we'll run down the names real quickly of who's who. Steve Buscemi is Mr. Pink. Harvey Keitel is Mr. White. Quentin Tarantino is Mr. Brown. Michael Madsen is Mr. Blonde. Tim Roth is Mr. Orange. And Edward Bunker, who I didn't mention originally, but he is Mr. Blue.
Yeah.
And he's only in there for, him and Tarantino are only in this film for maybe a total of 10 minutes.
Yeah. So, Bunker was not, like, he had some acting experience, but he had gotten into the kind of writing and film industry as a technical advisor working on crime movies because he was someone who had a very troubled youth. And
it's one of my fun facts.
Yeah, and was in
fun fact early
in prison ever since he was 17. Eventually, was put on parole in 1975 and started writing books and, like I said, working in the film industry as a consultant. So we really
because he did rob banks.
Yeah. We only see him a handful of times. We do see like everybody's death scene besides Mr. Blue, which apparently they had planned to film, but due to budgetary constraints, they had to cut it from it.
Okay.
So it adds a little bit of mystery, I guess, to the film as to like what kind of happened to the character, I guess, but it's interesting.
I mean, I don't need the explanation.
Right, yeah.
So it's fine. So after the diner scene is the very infamous credit scene that we see. I mean, it's in the trailers. It's in everything. It's a meme even at this point where they're all walking out smoking cigarettes. And this is set to the tune of Little Green Bag by a very famous group from the 60s. Obviously didn't see the fame they saw until this film, but...
Yeah.
They're Dutch. They're a Dutch group.
Apparently Tarantino wanted to use Pink Floyd's song Money for this scene, but of course Pink Floyd charges ridiculous amounts of money to license their music, and of course on a shoestring budget they couldn't swing that, so we got Little Green Bag instead.
I actually really admire the soundtrack of this movie.
Oh, absolutely.
I think every song is picked really well and does well for where it's placed for sure. And
it's all pre-recorded, like it's just a soundtrack. Like there's no original score or original music for the film.
Right.
Which I don't think really takes away from it, because the music choice in this is excellent.
No, I agree. I think it's great. So again, credits rolling, and then the screen kind of fades to black, and we hear some yelling. Clearly, someone's hurt at this point. And we see Mr. White driving away from wherever they just were, obviously. And Mr. Orange, who's in the backseat of the car, is shot, and he's definitely dying. He's shot in the stomach, so that's a slow, painful death, which sucks. Mr. White, though, is definitely trying to, like, calm him down, tell him he's going to be fine. And they're taking him back to the rendezvous point, and they'll get him a doctor, and, you're going to be okay. We then see Mr. White kick open a wooden door that leads into this warehouse where, as we kind of already mentioned, 90% of this movie takes place. And he just kind of keeps carrying him in there and then eventually lays him down on this, like, ramp, I guess you'd call it. He's in tons of pain, though, clearly, and bleeding very badly. It's also worth noting, though, at this moment that Mr. Orange starts calling Mr. White Larry. So he at least knows his first name throughout this film, or we know he knows that anyway. That'll come back later, but it is mentioned up front that he calls him Larry.
Yeah, Mr. White is definitely seen as like the more, I guess you could say, wholesome of the group. He's a little bit more understanding and emotional and empathetic. Compared to the rest of the characters, where like he's the only one that really seems to care that Orange is kind of dying in front of all of them, and he's typically the one to show some kind of humanity in these really shitty situations.
Yeah, he is very much like almost a father figure.
Yeah,
I would say to Mr. Orange. I guess not to the other characters, but
at least for the most of the movie until we get to the end. But we'll get to that later.
Right. He tells Mr. Orange, look, relax. You're not going to die. You're shot in the gut. It's fine. You live a long time after you get shot in the gut. You're going to be fine. We're going to call Joe. He's going to get you a doctor. He's going to fix you up. Mr. Orange then apologizes that he got his car all fucked up, which is kind of sad. But it's this back and forth kind of relationship you see them kind of develop over the next few minutes. And then he kind of begs him to take him to a hospital, which starts this very long and arduous process of him, coming to grips with the fact that he's dying and it's sad. And Mr. White can't take him to the hospital because they obviously did something illegal.
Right.
So
can't risk getting caught. Yeah.
Mr. Orange kind of gets upset and is like, just drop me off outside. It's going to be fine. I'll get there myself. And he's like, look, I can't do that. We don't know what's happening. Cops are all over this place, but I'll get a hold of Joe and you're going to be fine. He just, again, keeps reassuring him that that's going to happen. Mr. Pink then busts the door down himself and is just freaking out, like saying, what the fuck happened? He thinks this is a setup almost immediately, just based on what happened. And obviously he sees Mr. Orange at that point, realizes how bad the situation is. And then he starts asking about the other men that they were with. He kind of reiterates over and over again how the cops just showed up out of nowhere. And again, this has to be a setup. Mr. White trying to get him away from Mr. Orange so Mr. Orange can calm down, kind of leads him to this back room. And then they can also get cleaned up at that point. Mr. White's clearly covered in blood, so he needs to wash his hands, his face, whatever he can. Again, Mr. Pink going on and on about, freaking out that he was set up, and there's a lot of back and forth between them that it's not relevant to the story. It doesn't push it forward by any means. But Mr. White does eventually ask him how he got out of there, and he says, well, I just shot my way out, of course, because I had to. But we immediately cut to him just running down the street, being chased by cops. So that's not what happened at all. And then he knocks this poor woman out of her car and takes her car.
Yeah.
As the cops are chasing him. It's just mean, the way he goes about it. There's no other way to describe it.
Yeah, that's how I would be if I got carjacked. I'd be like, man, that guy was mean.
Yeah, mean. This poor woman, not even seeing it coming. We then cut back to them, and Mr. Pink says he's pretty sure he tagged a couple cops too, which could be true. I mean, we didn't see that. Then he asked Mr. White if he killed anybody, and he said, yeah, probably some cops too. I just, again, also shot my way out of there. Then Mr. Pink says, did you see Mr. Blonde? What the fuck was he doing? And Mr. White says, yeah, right? He was a fucking psychopath. What was Joe thinking hiring a guy like that? We're lucky he didn't just shoot us and run out with the diamonds. And Mr. Pink agrees, and he's like, yeah, I mean, you just don't lose your shit like that on people for no reason. And Mr. White says at that moment he almost killed him himself. But again, then they kind of speculate back and forth between what happened to him too, because he's also not there. Mr. White then asked finally about the diamonds, which is clearly what they went to this bank or wherever they are. We find out specifically what it is in a minute, but at the moment you're kind of led to lead this as a bank, not a business.
Some kind of big heist that they were,
Yeah, I guess it doesn't really matter in the end.
Yeah.
It's just, if you've never seen this movie, your brain probably first goes to bank. I mean, makes sense. Mr. Pink says, I've got the diamond zone. I stashed him. And Mr. White smiles and says, great, let's go get him. And he's like, no, we can't leave. we got to figure out what's going on. If we were set up, let's just wait here in the rendezvous place and hopefully someone will come and, we'll figure it out as a group, basically. They do kind of argue a little bit back and forth, though, before this scene is over about who might be the rat or someone who turned them in or be an undercover cop, whatever the situation may have played out for sure.
Yeah,
they accuse each other.
Yeah, I was kind of at like having not seen this movie before, I was almost convinced that it might have been Mr. Pink that was the rat, because he just kind of shows up, has this perfect story as to how he managed to get out of there. Is the one that kind of brings up the setup, potentially to try to, showing his concern to try to prove to the others that it's not him kind of thing.
Yeah, it's that trying too hard thing. Like trying too hard to point in another direction. So then it just ends up pointing back at you. Yeah. That's fair for sure.
I also want to note that Mr. Pink was Tarantino had originally planned to play Mr. Pink, but still allowed the rest of the cast to audition for the part, and he ended up going with Buscemi just because he enjoyed his performance, which I think is a great call, because if you've seen any Tarantino films, you would know Tarantino is not a good actor at all.
No, he's terrible.
Which I was very pleased to see that he only has like 2 scenes in this whole movie. Decent director, terrible actor.
Terrible actor.
Yeah.
And we might eventually cover this movie, but From Dusk Till Dawn, it's one of my favorite movies. But he has the biggest acting role, period, I think, in that movie.
Yeah.
And not only is he terrible, but he's also so terrible, he's convincing you that that's the kind of person he is.
Yeah.
There was a lot of time in my youth that I was like, Quentin Tarantino's a fucking creep. And he's probably a perfectly nice person, but he acted that part in From Dusk Till Dawn so well, it freaked me out every time I'd see him on screen. I was like, ew.
I know he's a big feet guy. I know that was a big... I
I
think it was even Brad Pitt mocked him at the Oscars or something about how much of Margot Robbie's feet are seen throughout the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Right. Either way, it was creepy for sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Pink also accuses Mr. Orange, of course, of being the rat, and Mr. White. This is the first time we really see him defend Mr. Orange against, anybody else that's trying to convince him that he's the rat, for sure. We then cut to Mr. White with Joe, bald guy from before. And we do this with every character in the film.
You get a little backstory, kind of flashback scene, kind of how they got introduced to the job. The
only people we don't see with Joe, as far as a relationship goes, is Mr. Brown.
And Mr. Blue.
Mr. Blue. Right. So the 2 people that died right away, we don't see their backstory anyway. So I'm going to have to assume that they're not as important of the people in this man's life than the others were.
Yeah.
Clearly.
That, or it might have also just come down to budgetary restrictions. And probably...
Right.
Yeah.
Because this scene isn't very long either, but it's still obviously extra, right? Basically, Joe's just telling him about this job and how he's going to get these diamonds and, it's a good deal and he'll be fine and it's routine, basically, for him. And he'll be in charge of the crew that he's putting together. We then cut back to the warehouse with Mr. White, Mr. Pink, and again, Mr. Pink wants to leave. And at this point, Mr. Orange looks pretty much dead. But I think he's just passed out from all the pain.
All the blood loss, yeah.
Probably. Mr. White's like, well, we can't move him and we can't take him anywhere. He needs medical attention or he'll die. And Mr. Pink's like, well, then I don't know what we're going to do. And they kind of have this back and forth. And Mr. White, again, is like, we just need to call Joe and get him here. And it's like, what the fuck's Joe going to do?
Yeah.
Is he a doctor? No. Like, I just don't understand why they keep thinking that's going to solve their problem.
Well, I think they keep referencing that as, like, they can get in contact with Joe. Joe can get in contact with the doctor who, will be able to fix him on the down low.
Fair enough. But throughout this whole time, you don't see either one of them try to get to a phone. So it's just weird. You'd think one of them would make the decision to go get to a payphone, go call Joe, go get somebody here.
Yeah.
And probably not Mr. White because he's covered in blood.
Right.
So maybe go get the phone, Mr. Pink. Anyway, he does tell him, though, that right before Mr. Orange passed out, he begged him to take him to a hospital. And Mr. Pink's like, well, if that's what he wanted, we should take him. And he's like, and do what? Leave him there and drive away? Like, you know, that's not a good idea either.
Yeah.
And it's at this moment Mr. White mentions to Mr. Pink, I think after Mr. Pink asks him or says something along the lines of, well, it's not like he knows us anyway. Mr. White's like, well, he knows a little about me. And they get into this, you know, argument about, well, why would you tell him stuff? And clearly Mr. White bonded with this guy, as we'll see in a little bit here, more than he probably should have.
Yeah, ends up telling him his first name, which we find out to be Larry, and where he's from.
Right.
And we'll find that in a future flashback, once we get to know a little bit more about Mr. Orange, that he, you know, is in fact trying to use that against him.
Absolutely. We then kind of pan out and we see Mr. Blonde standing there, drinking a Coke, like nothing's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Pink asks him about Mr. Blue and Mr. Brown. He says, well, they're dead. Mr. Orange got it in the belly, and Mr. White yells, okay, enough, and starts, you know, yelling at this guy, telling him he better start talking, like, what the fuck happened in there? And Mr. Blonde's like, you know, it is what it is. That people shouldn't have been in that situation, basically.
Yeah.
He's a clear sociopath in this entire movie.
Yeah.
But
which is interesting because when we see his kind of little flashback backstory, he seems like a very kind of cool, calm, collected, down-to-earth guy. And then we...
like normal.
Yeah. But then it's just like what we actually see on screen and what we hear the other characters talk about him is just like complete opposite.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Mr. White says, look, we don't think this is a safe place anymore. We should all leave and you should go with us. And Mr. Blonde says, no one's going anywhere. And Mr. White's like, you almost fucking killed me. I don't know what kind of guy you are, but I would never agree to work with you if I knew you were a psychopath, which is probably fair.
Yeah.
And again, he just is like, well, fuck it. They deserved it. I don't have to worry about this. And Mr. White's like, look, this whole situation's basically your fault. You know, you got him shot. You got the other two killed because you just started shooting up this place. And so they, again, arguing back and forth a little bit. They eventually all end up going outside, and Mr. Pink still is just, you know, insisting we got to get out of here. Mr. Blonde's like, no, we need to wait here for Nice Guy Eddie. I called him on my way here. We need to wait for him. And Mr. White's like, why didn't you fucking say that when you walked in here? Like, that's a link to Joe, too.
Yeah.
He needs to know what's going on. Whatever. So Mr. White says, well, did you physically talk to him? And he says, yeah, he told me to wait here. And then he kind of motions them over to his car, and he opens his trunk, and there's a fucking cop in there. So that sucks for the cop. But also, they kind of assume that maybe he can answer some of their questions, which I'm like, I'm not sure where this whole plot line was going as far as the cop's going to tell you anything, because I don't think he would have cracked either way.
Yeah. It's interesting that the cop's character named Melvin Nash, they actually had him, well, he volunteered to ride in the back of that car of Madsen's Cadillac, to know what
in the trunk?
Yeah, to know what it was like to actually be in the back of a trunk. And so Madsen would be the one to drive it around, and he would purposely drive it through roads that had like big potholes, and took the car through at Taco Bell, where Madsen ended up buying that soda for that scene where he just shows up drinking the soda.
God.
Yeah.
Well, A, I wouldn't get in the trunk, but B, way to be a dick about it.
Yeah. And Kirk Boltz is the name of the actor that plays the cop Melvin Nash.
Okay. Cool. We then cut to the scene of Mr. Blonde and how he knows Joe. And I think the only really important thing to mention here is Mr. Blonde went to jail for Joe. Mm-hmm. That's made very clear. He's also known this family for quite some time. Him and Nice Guy Eddie, which is Joe's son, hug and fuck with each other and, you know,
and
things like that.
Nice Guy Eddie is played by the late Chris Penn, who is Sean Penn's brother. And one thing that we didn't mention at the beginning during the diner scene is the way that it opens is Tarantino's character, Mr. Brown, is giving his like interpretation of Madonna's album "Like a Virgin," and you'll notice that Penn's character doesn't say doesn't give his 2 cents in the conversation, and this
because they were dating then.
Well, it was Sean Penn and Madonna were dating at the time, and so they were. I think had just gotten divorced, and so
okay.
Penn didn't want to say anything ill-willed about his former ex-sister-in-law.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot they were together / married. Yeah. Crazy. Oh, the 90s. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Yeah, so with that, Madonna was not a huge fan of Tarantino's interpretation of her album, and so she would go on to send Tarantino a copy of her follow-up album, Erotica, and signed it to Quentin. It's not about dick, it's about love. Because his whole thing about his interpretation of Like a Virgin is that, I don't know how much I want to get into this. It's very, if you just look up the clip on YouTube, I don't think we need to go too much into it. But
okay,
it's
I don't remember it. I don't remember the conversation at all.
Yeah, it's a bit, I don't know. I think
it's gross though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, that character, Tarantino, the way he portrays himself in movies, he's fucking creepy and gross and says things that are super inappropriate. Yeah. I don't get it. Why would you want to be that kind of an actor? You know what I mean? You're writing the movie.
Right.
Write yourself in the best light possible. Not a creepy, like, pedophile-y psychopath.
Right.
Just saying. Note to self, any directors out there. Don't put yourself in that position. Anyway, Mr. Blonde basically, tells Joe he needs a job. He wants to get back to work for him, but he's on parole, of course, being out of jail. And Eddie basically says, well, we'll arrange you a job at the docks. You make good money. You're going to be on our payroll. And then, in a few months when you get out of the spotlight of your parole, what am I trying to say?
Basically, once the his parole officer is off his back.
Parole officer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Then he can.
I don't know why that didn't come to my brain. Yeah, he can go back to work for them then. So, the scene ends with him thanking them, and we move on from that. We then cut to Eddie driving his car, and he's talking to, I thought it was the doctor on his cell phone, but it could have just been some random person, and he mentioned doctor. I honestly don't know.
Somebody who works within the family.
Yeah. This is intercut, though, with Mr. White, Mr. Pink, and Mr. Blonde beating the shit out of this cop because they think he's going to tell them, who the rat was in this situation, because he would know. This fucking beat cop, essentially, who probably literally just got the call because he was around the corner.
Right.
So, anyway, they end up duct taping him to a chair. The cop's just saying, I don't know anything about anything. I was just called here. And Mr. Pink says, well, we were definitely set up by cops. They were already there. So you got to know what's going on. And there's some more back and forth, but, nothing comes of this. So this poor guy goes through this.
They're just all yelling at each other because some think it's a setup, some say it's not. And it's just,
Right. Eddie finally arrives, though, and he hears this back and forth with the cop. He's mad the cop's there in general, which I probably would be too. And he basically tells Mr. Pink, you robbed a jewelry store in broad fucking daylight. Nobody set you up. This is just a shitty shit luck thing that happened. And, it is what it is. And Mr. White asks if he called a doctor. And he said, well, I did on my way here, but, he'll be here soon, basically. What were you going to say?
I was going to say this is good foreshadowing over the whole setup.
Fair enough. Yeah. He then basically asked them, why the hell are you beating up on this cop? This is stupid. Yeah. You beat him enough, he's just going to tell you whatever you want to hear, And so then he gives some people instructions. He tells Mr. Pink to go with him because we got to move these cars out front. It looks like a parking lot in front of an abandoned building. So it probably shouldn't look that way. And Mr. White says, well, you're not leaving me here with Mr. Blonde because he's a psychopath. And if your dad is mad now, he's not going to be half as mad as when I get into him to tell him what I've been fucking dealing with this guy. And Mr. Blonde, you know, smirking in the background, doesn't care about any of this. Eddie says, well, you idiots let this cop see your faces, so now it doesn't matter what happens or what he says, because he can't leave now. So we're going to have to deal with this, too. And Eddie then makes Mr. White and Mr. Pink go move the cars and go with him to get the diamonds, because also they need those. So Mr. Blonde gets down from his little, like, perch that he's sitting on and tells the cop that he, you know, we're alone at last, basically. Starts asking him again about this setup. Cop says he doesn't know anything about it. He's actually only been on the job for 8 months, so this poor fucking guy.
Whether or not that was true or he's just trying to say shit to get out of being tortured. But it's clear that Mr. Blonde does not give a shit and is going to torture this guy anyway. And even says that, I don't care what you say, I'm going to still do it. Yeah,
which is exactly what happens. I'm not going to go into huge detail with the torture scene.
Yeah.
It's obviously one of the hardest things to watch.
And I know that Madsen even struggled to perform the torture scene considering how gruesome it was, which is interesting considering that he's one of the more brutal characters in most Tarantino films that he's featured in.
Absolutely, he is.
But it was also one of the lines that Nash throws about being having a little kid, and of course that hit hard with Madsen because he had just become a father recently. So he definitely had a lot of moral struggles performing this scene.
Yeah.
So there's some good contrast there between the character and the actor that plays him.
Oh, I agree. Yeah. And I've heard I have friends that do like cons and stuff, and he did go to cons a lot, especially when Kill Bill 1 and 2 was not right out, because of course he was super famous, but a few years down the road, and as he's gotten older, and I've heard he's the nicest person in the world, like very, open to fan stuff and hugs and autographs and whatever they want, and I've heard he's just like the nicest guy in the world.
That's cool.
Which is crazy, because you
play
a really good psychopath. Like you said, in all of his movies, he's very brutal and has no conscience almost. Yeah. This kind of segues into the second most famous scene of this movie, where he is dancing to Stuck in the Middle with You.
Which they spent their entire $30,000 music budget on for this one song.
Yep. Right.
And apparently
because this is obviously iconic.
Right, yeah. Of course, it's an excellent choice. Apparently, they did have a backup plan in the event that they weren't able to get to the rights of the song. The plan was to use Ballroom Blitz by The Sweet. Which I still think would have been good. Of course, we have a certain perspective on it now since they did end up going with Stuck in the Middle with You. But I think it would be. I'm sure there's probably got to be an edit out there somewhere where someone has done it with Ballroom Blitz, with this trivia being out there. But I think that
tempo would have been off.
Yeah. But
I don't know. Maybe he would have done fine with that too.
$30,000 well spent.
It was, because this is by far the best scene in the movie, but also the worst scene in the movie.
Right.
Aside from one that I'll mention when I get down the road, but that's only because I really love Tim Roth a lot. As an actor, I think he's really great.
Tim Roth apparently had originally turned down the role when he was first approached with it, and it wasn't until he went out with Tarantino and Keitel for drinks that he eventually gave in and basically auditioned on the spot drunk and ended up getting the role. And this is Tim Roth is very early in his acting career.
But he had only done stage. He'd never done anything.
I think he had done some films before. I think they were still mostly independent. Foreign and independent. But this was one of his big breakout roles.
In American cinema. You're right. He had acted before, but he had been a very serious stage actor, drama actor, nothing like this ever before. Yeah. For sure.
And I guess because they weren't originally going to go with Tim Roth because he had turned it down, Samuel L. Jackson actually auditioned to play the role of Mr. Orange, but ended up not getting the role and blamed Tarantino and his producer, Bender. because they claiming that they made him nervous and mess up because of how much they were joking around during his audition, which would end up still working out for Jackson as he ended up being cast as Jules Winfield in Tarantino's next film, Pulp Fiction. Yeah, so it all worked out.
Which I have to say is a much bigger film than this ever was. Oh yeah,
100%. So. Yeah, I mean this movie I think Reservoir Dogs ended up grossing around $3 million in the box office. And of course,
it bombed.
And of course, really kind of took off when it came to home video, and of course, with the popularity of Pulp Fiction coming out just 2 years later, that really brought a lot of people's attention to Tarantino and his work, and it was really off the back of Pulp Fiction that people started taking a closer look at Reservoir Dogs, and yeah. And I think Reservoir Dogs ended up selling over like 900,000 VHS copies thanks to the success of Pulp Fiction. So
same with Natural Born Killers. It was critically,
Yeah, I saw it was not a very well reviewed movie.
No. Or what was the other one?
True Romance.
True Romance.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you know who Tarantino is and you follow him as like someone you admire, you're never going to know that's a movie he wrote too.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think it's because Tony Scott and Tarantino are two very different directors with two very different styles. Tony Scott is a lot more stylistic, I guess you can say, and Tarantino is, but in a very different way. Stylized is the word, not stylistic, but yeah.
Yeah, that's fair.
So
stuck in the middle with you playing. Mr. Blonde starts dancing around like a creepy creeper, because he is.
Yeah.
He's very intimidating at this point, and he's clearly taunting this guy. He pulls out a straight razor and just starts like
slicing his face up. Yeah.
Yep, slices his face, cuts his arm and leg. I think
he cuts his ear off.
Then he cuts his ear off.
Yeah.
Literally off. Cuts it off. Gross.
The makeup is pretty decent. Like it
is
for like where it's severed off. It almost looks like there's like a brain, almost just like with the texture of it. It looks really gnarly.
It is 100% what an inner ear would look like.
Yeah.
Google it.
I'm good.
I've seen it. It's very anatomically correct.
I'll take your word for it.
Makes it very gross as well. Cuts his ear off with the straight razor and then holds it up and talks into it, which is another iconic scene. Same scene, I guess you would call it, but the iconic portion of this scene. Then he tells the cop he'll be right back, and he runs out to his car and grabs a can of gasoline, which I'm not mad they decided on not doing this. But he does pour the gasoline on him, which of course would fucking burn anyway.
Yeah.
He rips the duct tape off his mouth, and he's begging him not to burn him alive. And this is where he mentions the family and the small child. And Mr. Blonde says, again, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do this. I'm going to light you on fire. And right before he lights a match, because he is about to light a cigarette, Mr. Orange sits straight up and unloads his entire clip into him, shooting him a good 5 feet off into the distance.
Yeah. Which I think at this point kind of gives away that Orange is the rat in the group.
Clearly.
Yeah. Funny enough, right after Orange executes Blonde, you hear the radio still in the background playing an ad for Jack Rabbit Slims, which is the 50s themed diner that Mia and Vincent go to in Pulp Fiction.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah. I didn't initially either. It wasn't until I did a little bit more research because I didn't.
That's cool.
Yeah. Of course, there are a lot of kind of Easter eggs in Reservoir Dogs. Kind of, it's hard to call them Easter eggs. I guess like there are a lot of things linking Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction into the same universe. Tarantino has even come out and said that Vic Vega, who plays Mr. Blonde, and Vincent Vega from Pulp Fiction are, in fact, brothers, and that's canon in the series. And there was apparently plans to make a prequel film for both brothers called Double V Vega, but it was one of those kind of side projects that wasn't really focused on a ton, and a lot of time ended up passing to the point where Travolta and Madsen just were a little too old to be able to pull off younger versions of themselves, which I think you could still get away with doing a film like this today, given what kind of de-aging technology we've seen in movies recently. So I'd be interested to still see something like that.
I think if you're going to do a Reservoir Dogs reboot type movie, no, you can't really use those same actors.
Yeah.
You could maybe pop them in for like the Joe character or the cop or, something. But no, you'd have to go with a younger cast.
Yeah.
And you'd have to make it way more fucked up and gory. Like, you can't just have this one scene with the cop. You're going to have to do like, kids these days don't give a shit about this movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you could do a reboot. I don't think Tarantino movies are, if you're a director out there, got a wild hair up your ass, I don't think you're going to want to reboot any Tarantino movies.
Yeah.
That's just my 2 cents.
Not without him
Leave
coming after you. Yeah. He's already taken a lot of issue with a lot of the films that he's written and had other people direct. Like for Natural Born Killers, he has straight out said, if you are a fan of my work, do not watch this movie.
Yeah, he didn't like it.
Yeah.
Which, it's not a terrible film.
I have not seen it. I understand it's kind of like a Bonnie and Clyde type story.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah.
But again, if you're a Tarantino fan, you do love that movie.
Yeah.
It's well written as far as how the character development goes and things. I'm going to go as far to say is it just wasn't directed well.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of holes that you could, you could have cleaned up before you edited this film. Editing probably too just didn't go well.
Yeah.
So where were we? Oh yeah, ears off. Orange kills blonde, goes flying. Then the cop recognizes him and calls him by his first name and says, "Yep, that's me. I'm Freddie, I believe his name is." And he's like, "Well, I'm Marvin, and why didn't you do this sooner?" Basically, like, this guy's fucking tortured me over here.
Yeah. He's like, "Well, I'm fucking dying over here, man."
Literally. Look at my gut. It's out. My guts are out.
Yeah, and you just see, like, at the bottom of the ramp, just, like, a huge, deep pool of blood.
Yeah, there's a lot, for sure. We then cut to Mr. Orange's story, and he is indeed the cop. He's an undercover agent. And I'll just quickly mention, in the late 80s, early 90s, is the undercover cop heyday. There's so many police officers doing this as part of their job. A lot dying, unfortunately, because of this as well. So it's not a surprise to me that, one, this brutality happened to police officers in this film, and two, there was no backup coming, essentially, until, the big fish showed up, essentially, which you would never see these nowadays, that just wouldn't happen. But anyway, we see a, montage of him, and I'm thinking it's his partner, ? They never say.
I think it's, I don't know, a partner, maybe some kind of higher up, because he definitely seems to be, like, reporting to him.
Maybe his handler.
Something like
that's
that.
What they called him back then.
Yeah,
he's something.
Because I know that
also a cop. Also a cop.
In the deleted scene where they're getting the rundown from McCluskey, they're like sitting together, so it is almost kind of like, from what I've seen of that deleted scene, it does seem like they're kind of partners. But the way that we actually see it in the film is like, yeah, he's more of a handler, because he's like teaching him how to kind of act, because he's going to need to really play up the role if he's going to really fit in with the gang and won't have to worry about being caught.
Yeah, because that's exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
He gives him a script. He physically hands him a script. You have to memorize this. You have to say these in the right way, and they'll believe you. And we see scenes of him out with Mr. White and Eddie and Joe. They're at a bar. They're at a strip club. They're at random places. So clearly, this guy has weaseled his way in enough to this crime family, if you want to call it that, to feel like he belongs. So he does tell the story of when he was not arrested, but almost arrested after buying a bunch of weed. And he ends up going to the bathroom, and he has a lady's purse with him, which is something odd they don't really touch on in the scene. But I remember this being a bigger deal than it was in the movie, like having the purse. But I was wrong. But he goes into this bathroom, takes a pee. He's got weed on him, and I think in the purse. That's why I guess I thought it was a bigger deal that he had the purse, because that looks weird as a man holding a purse. But there's a bunch of cops in there and a drug-sniffing dog. Now, again, this didn't really happen in real life.
Right. But they have a kind of a flashback recreating the story that he's telling you. I guess not recreating, but creating the story that he's telling. Yeah.
To, again, make him seem like he belongs in this crowd of people. And basically, you know, the cops don't search the purse. They don't search him, even though the dog's barking at him. And, you know, they all laugh and think that's hilarious and kind of call him lucky to an extent at that point. And I think that you see that relationship with Mr. White kind of form at that moment, too, because he's asking him all these questions. And, you know, it's a nice moment at that moment, I guess, for the story.
And you do see, like, some of the guys, when he's telling the story, kind of pick out a couple plot holes here and there, but his character does a good job of kind of, like, coming up with a quick response on the fly, it seems like, to make sure that his cover's not blown. So.
Yeah. And then we cut to Joe at this moment, and he has arranged everybody, so all the gentlemen with their and he's giving them their names at this point. And, of course, Mr. Pink argues about his name because he's clearly the little bitch of the group and doesn't want to just take what's given to him. But, anyway, eventually they all get settled on the names, and then we see Mr. White and Mr. Orange sitting in the car casing the diamond place they're going to rob. Mr. White's kind of giving him some tips on how to subdue citizens in the shop, I guess you'd call it. Is it? I don't know if it's like a chain or it's like a smaller jewelry store. You never see it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how big it is inside and like how many people would really be in there. But in this scene, he's making it seem like there would be a lot of people. So this is how you would like deal with, you know, the people.
People start to act tough. You make sure that you kind of put them in their place.
But don't kill them.
Right, yeah.
He makes that clear, too. Again, Mr. White's this, like,
he's
that
gone,
kind of a figure.
He's gone down this road before.
Yeah, and he doesn't want to kill anybody. Robbing people is different than killing people in his mind.
Yeah.
Which,
fair
point.
Unless they're cops. Because they don't give...
Unless they're cops.
Because they make a point throughout the movie a couple times where they'll ask each other, is like, any, you know, making sure that they didn't kill any civilians, and that if they did kill anybody, it's just a cop.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
Big
true.
ACAB energy in this movie, for sure.
Absolutely. We then just immediately cut to him and Mr. Brown, and they're in the car, clearly driving away from the initial robbery as well. But Mr. Brown is shot in the head, so he wrecks the car and he dies, and we see that happen. We then see cops kind of chase them around, and him and Mr. Orange start running, of course, from those sirens and the police officers, and they come up to a car with another woman in it. They're going to steal the car, but she has a gun. And this is how Mr. Orange gets shot. He does not get shot by a police officer.
Yeah.
So
it's
like rotten luck.
Right. And I think that should have still been some kind of... So, because when they're all arguing and Mr. White is vouching for Mr. Orange, he says, he's like, I watched this guy take a bullet to the gut. There's no way. But it's like, it's not a cop that shot him, though.
Right.
So,
this was pure dumb luck that he got shot.
So that doesn't necessarily rule him out. So unless there's some maybe it's just a continuity thing with the writing. But I would say that, you know, him being shot by a civilian doesn't necessarily rule him out as the rat. And so that ends up,
No. I agree.
Yeah.
It's not like he dove in front of Mr. White and took a bullet.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I would believe a more father-son protector relationship from him if that's what ended up happening, but it's not. And I think that's the point, right? The point is Mr. White should have never felt any sort of way to this complete stranger.
Yeah.
And he did. And that ends up biting him in the ass.
He let his emotions get too invested in the job.
Right. Because then we're immediately back in the warehouse with Eddie, Mr. White, Mr. Pink, now returned. But they see this mess. You know, they see the cop. They see Mr. Blonde dead over there. Mr. Orange then says, look, he cut that cop's ear off and he was going to kill me and light him on fire, so I fucking shot him.
Mm-hmm.
And Eddie starts freaking out because, again, we know the relationship and back history with Mr. Blonde and Eddie. And he's like, wait, this guy just shot a cop out of nowhere? And Mr. Orange says, well, he cut his ear off first and then he was going to light him on fire.
Mm-hmm.
And Eddie's like,
this cop?
He's got this.
And then he pulls,
right.
And then he kills the cop.
Right. Then he just shoots the cop. And then he explains to Mr. Orange about how he just got out of prison serving 5 years for his dad. Mm-hmm. And why would he turn on us and be the one that was the rat at this moment? Because that's kind of how Mr. Orange is,
right,
describing the events that happened. And Mr. White just says, look, he is a psychopath. He tells him what he did in the jewelry store. And again, Eddie's just like, fuck this. He was my friend. And at that moment, Joe walks in. They all kind of fill him in on what's going on. Joe also agrees that he wouldn't have just done that. Mm-hmm. And, clearly Mr. Orange is the one that's the rat. So he starts pointing a gun at him. And Mr. White points his gun at Joe and says, if you shoot him, I'll kill you. Now, again, mind you, Mr. White probably has known Joe, what?
Decades.
A long time?
Yeah.
Right. Could be decades. He probably knows Eddie just as well. But he is putting his life on the line for basically a stranger.
Yeah. And for the wrong reasons, too.
Right. Because he got shot? Mm-hmm. Anyway. So Eddie then points his gun at Mr. White and says, if you shoot him, I'll shoot you. And Joe basically is like, no, sorry. Eddie starts saying, Larry, we've been through tons of jobs together. Stop pointing that fucking gun at my dad. Mm-hmm. They kind of argue back and forth for a minute again. And then they all just shoot each other.
Yeah.
That's all that really happened.
Because I know that Harvey is holding, or Mr. White is holding the gun at Joe. Eddie is holding the gun at Mr. White. But then, unless I didn't see that maybe Mr. White turns and shoots both Joe and Eddie, I didn't see who would have been the one to shot Eddie, because there was no gun pointed at him.
I have a fun fact.
Okay. Because my initial thought was that Mr. Pink was the one that did it, because he's hiding kind of off to the side with gun in hand.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that maybe he did it, so that way he could be the one to get away. But
that's wrong.
Okay.
But good guess. Yeah. Because, Mr. Pink just dips.
Yeah.
He runs out. And he knows where the diamonds are. Mm-hmm. So, honestly, at the end of the day, he probably made out the best of all these men. Clearly, he's still alive, so there's that.
He's the only one to live, too.
Yeah, he's the only one to live. Because Joe's dead, Eddie's dead, and Mr. White is clearly gravely injured. Mm-hmm. He can't survive from this. He kind of rolls over to Mr. Orange. He's still laying there dying, too. And we start to hear more sirens. And then he holds his head. He did this basically at the beginning. It's like a father thing.
Yeah.
You would hold your son close like that. And Mr. Orange apologizes and just says, I'm the cop. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. I'm the one. I'm sorry.
Pranked you.
Yep. But then this is the only moment that really gets me in this film is how Harvey Keitel reacts to this news. Mm-hmm. And he yells out, it's the most devastating thing he's ever heard in his life. Yeah. That's how he makes it seem. The emotion that's there is really poignant. Yeah. But Mr. Orange tries to apologize again, and Mr. White just points the gun at his head, cries out again. We then we hear cops swarm the warehouse. We don't see any of this, which is about to happen. And they're yelling at Mr. White to drop the gun. Then we just hear tons of gunshots, and everybody falls out of frame, and that's the movie. Yeah. Again, not a lot to it.
Yeah. Like we said, it does get really intense and action-packed in some scenes, but it's a lot of just talking, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I very much enjoyed it. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you liked it. It's definitely a cult classic film.
Oh, 100%.
By definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely, I agree with you. It's not my favorite Tarantino movie.
Yeah.
I would say that I probably like Pulp Fiction a little bit more. I enjoy the Kill Bill movies a lot. Hateful Eight is solid. Django is good. I have not seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood or Death Proof.
Don't waste your time.
No.
Ooh. We got to do those. We have to do Death Proof, and we have to do
Pulp.
what's the other one? Nope, the one him and Rodriguez did together. Planet Terror and Death Proof. We have to do both of them. We'll do a month of those.
Okay. My buddy Emerson he really likes Death Proof, but from what I understand, it's
so good.
I heard it was like one of the least well received films that he directed.
I don't care.
Okay, well,
it's really good.
Fair enough.
It's really, really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's so many cool things about that. So if we're gonna do those, we need to find the box set to purchase.
Okay.
Because there's so many really cool things on. The first time I ever saw those two movies, I watched them on a box set. I was dating a guy who had them. There's so many bonus stuff and extra content in that specific box set that they came out together in. It's fucking really cool.
Well, I'm sure most of that's probably been posted online by now, considering that movie came out, in the early thousands, I think?
Maybe, but
Yeah.
I'm telling you, the box, honestly, it's just worth it to have it.
Okay. I got you.
If we can find it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned that you have a few fun facts. I also have a couple more. But if you want to go ahead
Go
and get
ahead.
us. Oh, okay. So apparently George Clooney had also auditioned to play the role of Mr. Blonde. Of course, it was one of those things that just didn't end up working out. But of course, things would end up working themselves out as Clooney and Tarantino would work together on the film Dusk Till Dawn, directed by Robert Rodriguez and written by Tarantino, or co-written by Tarantino.
Do you know why he didn't cast Clooney?
I didn't see the specifics on that.
Because he was on ER.
Oh, okay.
That's when he was Dr. whatever on ER, and he was the most famous actor, ever at the moment.
Gotcha.
And he couldn't see him doing that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they got Harvey
Yeah.
Keitel in it, though. So, I mean, they got...
Harvey Keitel had done plenty of
Right.
violent stuff, though.
But yeah,
Sorry,
it's,
go
but
ahead.
it's still interesting how, if that's a bit too violent, then they'd go on to still do Dusk Till Dawn later on.
However, George Clooney's character in that movie is a very empathetic
Yeah, he definitely seems
end
a lot
of the
more
day
passive.
hero.
Yeah.
So,
Lawrence Tierney, who ended up playing Joe, was apparently very difficult to work with on set, often causing a lot of arguments and even physical confrontations, one in particular with Tarantino, which resulted in Tarantino threatening to fire Tierney on the spot, which apparently was met by applause by everybody on set at the time.
yeah, he was drunk a lot, right?
I don't know if he was drunk. I just heard that he was just a pain in the ass to work with and was
I think he
often
was.
forgetting his lines and, putting them behind schedule, and
Yeah, I want to say drugs and alcohol were definitely a problem.
kind of
too.
a Marlon Brando type,
Yeah. Touche.
The film, the editor of the film, Sally Mankey, was advised by her agent not to work on this film. One of those things where they believed that it would ruin her career, especially since she had just made her way into the industry, editing the 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle film,
Ooh.
which is a childhood favorite of mine.
We should probably do that one too.
100%. I've actually been seeing a lot of YouTube videos pop up recently of people talking about the Ninja Turtle movie, so I'd be so down to go back and watch
Yeah, we should
those.
probably do that.
Yes, 100%.
Like a kid month.
Yeah.
Like movies when we were a kid.
Yeah. But Mankey decided to take the job anyway, and this would, start her and Tarantino's nearly 28-year working relationship before she would unfortunately pass away to heat stroke in 2010.
Oh, my.
Yeah. I think she was on a nature hike or something, and it's just...
What a random way to die.
Yeah.
That's sad.
Yeah. The film was heavily inspired by Ringo Lam's 1987 cult classic thriller City on Fire, which features a lot of similar plot elements, such as a botched heist, a severely wounded undercover cop that makes their way into the gang, and a Mexican standoff style ending. Tarantino would eventually, or it would even dedicate the script to Chow Yun-fat, who was one of the stars of City on Fire.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely a big inspiration from that movie.
Yeah. I kind of have that later, but I'll wrap around to it.
Yeah.
And explain why I'm going to repeat it.
Go for it.
So I have a few as well. Michael Madsen's dance when he cuts the cop's ear off was completely improv the day of. He didn't rehearse it once. which I think is fucking amazing since he nailed it.
Right, yeah. It's also
it's the creepiest shit I've ever seen.
It's also interesting considering considering he apparently had a lot of moral issues with doing the torture scene, how he was just kind of able to break out into dance like that. Maybe he was just trying to distract himself from the brutality that was about to ensue. But
yeah, because it was shot backwards.
Yeah.
So it starts with him pouring gasoline and then ends with him dancing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Gotcha.
I think you're probably right. The first showings of this film had the most walkouts of any initial viewing by critics and directors.
Yes, that's another thing I have. The premiere of this film at Sundance Film Festival was a total clusterfuck for many reasons. The film was shot in widescreen, so to project it properly requires a specific aperture plate that the projectionist at Sundance didn't have. So basically, with the way that you would see it, it would just like stretch the image like past the screen and onto the curtains. And then there were also other technical issues where like the house lights eventually went up at one point during the movie, and the power had cut out during like one of the most intense scenes. I believe it was during the Mexican standoff at the end where the power had cut and.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So it was just a complete and total fucking disaster, which, but Miramax would eventually, go on to attain the distribution rights and get it into theaters. And it did end up doubling its budget, but usually for a movie to actually make any money, you kind of need to make almost 3 times as much to make up for what's put in for like marketing. Granted, I don't know how much was put in, how much of a marketing budget there really was for this movie.
Yeah, me neither.
But I do know that the film kind of set, maybe precedent's not the right word, but they kind of helped invent the style of the single character movie posters, because when the posters that were released, there was one for each member of the gang that you could get.
Right. Very collectible still to this day. I found one on eBay for like $3,000.
Jesus.
I think it's signed, but still, that's a lot. So 33 total walkouts, including Wes Craven, who didn't stay after the ear cutting incident.
I believe
I'm out.
The film that scene was cut in some versions that were released in other countries.
It was, yeah, definitely cut. You know what happened. You see the ear thing where he talks, but you don't see it come off. Yeah, which would have been fine with me too. Like you said, it premiered at the 1992 Sundance Film Festival, where it was the buzziest movie for sure. Everyone was talking about how excited they were to see it, and then of course all this technical shit plagued it, and critics walking out and whatnot. Again, only grossing a little over $2.9 million in its opening weekend, which isn't great. Yeah, obviously. The warehouse where most of the movie was shot was actually an abandoned mortuary in downtown LA with no electricity and no AC. So shooting in August of LA, it was fucking terrible. Yeah. Yeah, everyone hated it. And Mr. Orange's apartment was above it. They decorated that as well. Okay. So, yeah. Very cool. We do see Keitel as a producer on the film, which you kind of mentioned. The gun showdown at the end, which you talked about earlier. So we see Joe pointing a gun at Mr. Orange, who's on the floor, Mr. White pointing at Joe, and nice guy Eddie pointing at Mr. White. So Joe shoots Orange, White shoots Joe, and Eddie shoots White, but you hear 4 gunshots. That's why you probably were looking around to see who actually shot Joe. That was an accident. Harvey Keitel's fake gun thingy, whatever they call that, went off after he pulled the trigger, and it was never edited out of the film. Yeah, which I thought was kind of cool. So you kind of mentioned, of course, Tarantino's love of that film and how he, thanked it in the credits and things like that. This is clearly Tarantino's bread and butter. He likes violent crime style movies. He references a lot of pop culture things within his film, profanity, racism, things like that. And then his nonlinear storytelling type. I think that makes his movies well done, but also hard to follow. And you can either really love Tarantino as a director, or you can hate him. There's, I don't think, a really good in between. You might like one of his movies, but hate the rest.
Yeah, one of my film professors in college always argued that Tarantino's films always seemed like they were basically just rip-offs of other people's movies, and I can definitely see that. Granted, he does bring his own kind of twisted, violent twist to everything, but yeah, looking back, everything is kind of just like a different version of another already existing movie.
Right, and that kind of circles back to that crime noir type vibe.
Yeah.
There's always a heist or a robbery or someone's been done wrong in a movie of his.
Yeah.
Even up until Django, which I would say is probably his best film, period. I would put that at number 1. But again, it's a I've been done wrong story.
Yeah.
Now his redemption story in that is much better than any other film. Even Kill Bill.
For sure.
Like her redemption arc is wonderful for a woman, but a slave.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of competing there. But again, yeah, that consistent violence, consistent things that you expect from Tarantino, honestly, that it does seem like he carries over to every film for sure. But this has definitely earned itself the cult status.
Yeah.
Based on some of that motif. So he did a good job.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I think it still would have been really interesting to see this, shot on the original shoestring budget of around $30K, seeing it shot in black and white.
I would have liked a 16 millimeter shot. Yeah.
I think that would have been really interesting. But it kind of shows that, like, to have a successful film, it's really all about who managing to get in contact with Harvey Keitel, who would, help kind of produce the film and introduce it to a bunch of other producers that would help finance the film. And, but yeah, I still think, because Tarantino is all about, if you really love cinema, then you just go out and you just go and make movies. You don't have to go to film school or whatever, which I definitely agree with the sentiment on that. But I still think it would have been interesting to see it done kind of, Clerk style.
I would have also loved to see, I listened to another podcast called Dirty Little Whore, and they talk about James Wan's directing style and how he, granted he's a horror film director, but he likes to put in his films, they're not black and white, they're black and blue. And then he'll put in bright colors right at times that are, extremely scary or extremely poignant to the film. And I think Tarantino could have benefited for some of that color scheming. I remember also a friend of mine back in the day reviewing a film, and he compared Tarantino's to Sin City.
Oh, yeah.
And how a lot of people thought Sin City was a Tarantino film initially when they saw trailers.
Well,
and I can see all that.
Wasn't Tarantino, did he help write it? I wasn't he involved in the production of Sin City at some
I don't think he was involved at all. Wasn't that Frank Darabont?
I know Frank Miller was the director and the original creator of Sin City, but I could have sworn Tarantino had some kind of involvement in the production process.
Rodriguez did.
I have to Google this now.
And I thought Frank Darabont that does The Walking Dead had something to do with it too, but maybe it's Frank Miller that I'm thinking of and I confuse the names.
Sin City. Quentin.
But it's that kind of, using color in the right way can be more dramatic than over-the-top violence.
I think he has to have some kind of producer credit or something. Hold on, I gotta pull up the IMDb.
Put in the do.
Yeah.
Put in that music.
Sin City, 2005. Directors Frank Miller and Quentin Tarantino.
Oh,
Tarantino was like an assistant kind of special guest director alongside Robert Rodriguez.
And that makes sense.
So, yeah.
But yeah, it's pulling things like that are very, you could do that and not go over the top violent. And that I think would have been better in some aspects.
Yeah.
I don't hate this film. It's not my favorite Tarantino film, but it's still good.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's going to be about it for episode 24 of Cult Cinema Podcast. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning into this episode. If you have any suggestions for what movies we should review in the future, feel free to leave them in the comments if you're on YouTube or in the review, or if you're on Apple Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you're not already, so that way you know when new episodes drop, so that way you can listen to them on the fly or on the spot. I don't really know where I'm going with the rest of this sentence. But yeah.
Just follow all the things and subscribe and leave us a review. That'd be great.
And follow us on Instagram. We're finally going to be releasing like sneak peeks, so that way you know what you're going to be getting into. I've been talking about it for months now, and we're finally doing it. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, I think that.
And then next week
What are we doing for the next episode? Do we know?
Next week is one of my favorite movies.
Yeah.
Office Space.
Yeah! I love that
Yay!
movie. Yes, I love Office Space. It's so
Get
good.
some comedy back in here.
Finally. All right. Thank you again, everybody, for tuning into the episode, and we will see you in the next one.